Thank you, Amin. Yes, it is, as Amin's just said, our event for Interfaith Week, which is a national week, and many interfaith events are held. Tonight is actually the start of Interfaith Week, and we finish, I think it's next Sunday. Now, this is also the 136th event of the Muslim Jewish Forum in the last 16 and a half years. So we're very proud of that. And as Amin said before we came on air, that this is the highest Zoom registration. We've actually had 50 people register. Whether they'll all attend at the end of the day is another matter, but obviously the subject is of great interest. The format will be, first of all, Professor Matras will give his presentation, and then we have 4 panelists who I'll introduce when the time comes. One is originally from France, one from Germany, one from Hungary, and one from Pakistan. And they will tell their personal journeys, linguistics journeys. And then there'll be a Q&A for about 45 minutes, of which Amin will be mainly in control. He'll look at the hands and notice the hands, whether mechanical or in the chat. And after those 45 minutes, Afzal Khan, our co-founder, will give a vote of thanks. And then that's that. So that's the format of the evening. So I shall now introduce our first speaker and the main presenter for this evening. That is Professor Yaron Matras. He was born in Chicago, but he only lived there for the first 8 months of his life. He was raised in Israel and in Canada. He attended the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, University of Tübingen, I think, University of Hamburg. Until last year, he was the Professor of Linguistics at Manchester University, where he founded and led the Multilingual Manchester project. His research interests include the Romani language, Middle Eastern languages, German dialects. He has a particular interest in the many languages of Manchester and was responsible for putting Manchester on the map as Britain's city of languages. Yaron is now Honorary Professor at the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics and is the co-founder of a new initiative called Manchester City of Languages that aims to promote awareness and pride in multilingualism. So without further ado, Yaron Matras, please can you give your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Language is something that we all have. And I've never met a person who doesn't have some kind of interest in language. But let me just start with a couple of words and tell you why I'm interested in languages. And it has to do with my biography, which was always multilingual, and I was raised in multilingual environments, as Heather mentioned. And I also have a bit of a Manchester connection. So despite my accent and despite the fact that I'm an immigrant who came here about 26 years ago, but my great-grandparents met and married and had their first child in Manchester. They were originally from Brody in Galicia, which was then Austria and is now Poland. And they came here speaking Yiddish and joined the large Eastern European Jewish community in Cheetham Hill. And that's where they lived for a few years. And during that time, obviously, they learned English, but they were also in transition to German. So Yiddish was their spoken language. German was the language that they were writing, and there's some interesting family documents. So, for example, an invitation to their wedding reception was printed in German in Manchester in 1898, I think, or 1902 or something like that, and so on. And they didn't like Manchester, and they left after a few years and moved back. And they sadly perished in the Holocaust. My grandmother survived. But I know the story in those various documents, but I found the story very inspiring, and my great-grandfather actually wrote a diary about his life in different languages. It's handwritten, in Yiddish, English, German, Polish, and Hebrew. So languages have been in the family for many generations, and languages are an aspect of everybody's identity. It's what connects us with past generations. It's what helps us define community. It's a carrier of our culture. And in a way, you know, the diversity of language represents the diversity of peoples, of cultures, of practices. But at the same time, it's also where people tend to erect these imagined demarcation boundaries between communities and human beings. And they defend those boundaries with such a vigor, and that's what brings about a lot of fear and destruction. And so for me, to engage with multilingualism is to tackle head on these unnecessary anxieties and animosities between people that separate people from one another, and to build bridges. And that's what brings me to the topic. Let me start with some general information on languages in Manchester before I do a quick tour of the languages that are specifically used by Muslims and Jews. So we just had a census a few months ago, and we still don't have the results. But the census that we have results for, and where there is information on languages, is now 10 years old. And back then in 2011, about 17% of the residents of the city of Manchester reported to have a main language other than English. Now that question is an awkward question anyway, and my research has shown that that figure is considerably underreporting. So many people didn't actually put down their language, even though they have other languages than English. One indication is that the annual school census, I think it's actually carried out even twice a year, and that regularly has been showing us in the past decade that about 40% of pupils in Manchester's schools are multilingual. That too underreports, in my opinion. So we can say, I think safely, that for Greater Manchester, at least 50% of young people are multilingual. Another indication, Manchester Royal Infirmary, with its particular catchment area in central Manchester, processes around 100,000 requests for interpreting in doctor-patient communication every year. That's about 10% of the patients that they see altogether. So those are the people who actually need an interpreter to talk to a doctor. And of course, that in its is a minority. I've been quoted as saying that about 200 languages are spoken in Manchester. And I'm not disowning that statement, but I have to, in this forum, say to you that it's a soundbite, but I've always said that it's very difficult to accurately count languages. What is a language versus a dialect? What is a language that is spoken? How long does it have to be spoken in Manchester? And so on. But based on the statistics that we have, it's approximately accurate. What we can count more easily is how many languages are written on signs, public signs in Manchester, and make up what we call our linguistic landscape. And there's about 50 of those. And a final statistic is that upwards of 5,000 pupils attend language-based supplementary schools at weekends or evenings. And that says a lot because it shows the interest and the commitment of families to maintain their heritage languages, and also the extraordinary effort that teachers are doing, mainly volunteers, running supplementary schools. Manchester also has a language strategy in preparation. The City Council has a city language strategy. It has had that in preparation for several years. I was invited to draft it, and there are a few publications, but it's a bit stuck along the way, and I very much hope that we can move that forward. Those of you here who have functions in the City of Manchester, or indeed in Greater Manchester, it would be great to see a Greater Manchester effort toward a language strategy. Now, as you know, Muslim and Jewish populations first began immigrating to Manchester in the second half of the 19th century. Among them were my great-grandparents. And there's interesting similarities between the language situation of the two populations, if we kind of generalize. So first of all, both have liturgical languages, Hebrew and Arabic. Hebrew, the language of the Bible and Mishnah and Talmud and other liturgical texts, and Arabic, the language of the Quran, and liturgical texts and hadith written down and so on. And as it happens, both are related languages. Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages. And the further you go back in time, so to biblical Hebrew and classical Arabic of the Quran, the greater the similarities are. So compared to the spoken languages that are spoken today. People read those languages and use them for religious purposes across the different languages that they speak. And that is a very powerful factor that unites populations in the Jewish and the Muslim communities respectively around the learning and the practicing of the liturgical languages. And the script that is used for Hebrew and for Arabic respectively is also the one that is often used to write many of the languages spoken by these populations. We have to distinguish between written and spoken languages. I'll come back to that later. And we also have to, for the purpose of this discussion, distinguish between what I would call community languages and the languages of individuals. So when I'm highlighting now various languages that are spoken by Muslims and Jews in Manchester, of course, that can't be comprehensive. There's always going to be individuals who speak additional languages. So I'm going to focus on those that have sizable communities that are visible and audible and have a large presence in Manchester. And of course, there are Muslim and Jewish people who speak many, many other languages. I'll start with the languages of Jews because there are fewer of those and they're easier to enumerate. But perhaps also require a bit more explanation. And I think the one that obviously I'm taking for granted that people know English, so I'm not going to talk about English. But the language that stands out as the Jewish language of Manchester Jews is Yiddish. Now, Yiddish is a Germanic language. That is, it is historically related to German, particularly to the dialects of German that are spoken in southwest Germany. And it developed as a dialect that was spoken by German Jews in medieval times. And then as those people were driven out towards Eastern Europe, Poland in particular, the language took on an independent development and became later on written down in the Hebrew script and became a flourishing language of literature and administration and schooling and so on, and press in Eastern Europe. And the Holocaust, of course, put an end to that as the majority of the Yiddish-speaking population perished, and those who survived after the war usually shifted to the national languages of the various countries where they remained or immigrated to. So nowadays, Yiddish is spoken almost exclusively by the Orthodox, sometimes labeled ultra-Orthodox. In Hebrew, we call it the Haredi community, communities. And Manchester is one of the largest populations, actually, of the largest communities of Yiddish speakers. The others are in New York, Montreal, in Israel, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Antwerp, and London, of course. But Manchester is among the top 4 or 5 communities of Yiddish speakers. If you know the Orthodox Jewish community, you know that they have very large families. So there's actually an expansion of Yiddish. More and more people are speaking Yiddish simply because of the demographics. And Yiddish is mainly a family language, but it's also used in classroom instruction in the Orthodox community. It's used in children's books. It's also used in books for religious teaching. And it's used for announcements and notices, but mainly indoors. You'll rarely see Yiddish written out on the streets of North Manchester. And we're talking about areas like Broughton in Salford and Prestwich in Manchester. But if you go into the Jewish institutions indoors, you'll see a lot of notes in Yiddish. In the Jewish community, Hebrew is used for writing. The signs on Jewish institutions in Manchester are usually in Hebrew. It's used for religious studies. And there's actually 2 varieties of Hebrew. The first can be called Ashkenazic Hebrew. They differ in the pronunciation and style primarily. And Ashkenazic Hebrew is the language that is used particularly for prayer, but also for writing announcements on administrative and secular affairs. And the other is Israeli Hebrew. So that's the Hebrew that's spoken in Israel. And there are people, of course, from Israel who have immigrated to Manchester, like myself, but many in the Orthodox community in North Manchester and Salford as well, who are bilingual, and they speak Israeli Hebrew and Yiddish, and of course also know liturgical Hebrew. Other languages of Jewish communities in Manchester are rather marginal in terms of numbers. There are some speakers of Judeo-Neo-Aramaic or Jewish Neo-Aramaic, So this is there's actually only Jewish and Christian populations who now speak Aramaic, and they originate from Mesopotamia, so the area of Iraq, Iran, and most of the Jewish population left there in the early 1950s. And most of the Christian population speaking Aramaic was driven out lately by ISIS in the last few years. But there are some speakers in Manchester. There are some speakers of Ladino, which is related to Spanish. It's kind of a Jewish variety of Ladino. And some speakers of Judeo-Arabic, so an Arabic dialect spoken by Jews from Baghdad, who immigrated to Manchester's elderly generation. So now over to the languages of Muslims in Manchester, and the first that obviously we need to give our attention to is Arabic. Arabic is the fastest growing language in Manchester in recent years due to immigration, partly refugees, but also other immigrants, people also coming to study. Arabic, as you may know, is spoken in very different dialects. There is, of course, the written Arabic, standard Arabic, which is shared across the Arab world and which pretty much defines who is an Arab. Who is an Arab? You know, the persons who use standard Arabic as their literary language, if they have a literary language. But the dialects of Arabic differ quite considerably and sometimes are not even mutually intelligible. It depends. And the main Arabic dialects that are spoken in Manchester are Syrian Arabic, Libyan Arabic, Iraqi Arabic, and Sudanese Arabic. There are, of course, others, but those are the main dialects that are spoken. Arabic, we'll see when the census results come out, I think in a few months we'll get them. In the last census, Urdu was the largest language in Manchester other than English. And Manchester was distinct in that from the national average. If you remember from 10 years ago, Polish came second after English at national level, ahead of Wales, ahead of Welsh, even in Wales. And well, not in Wales, but in England and Wales together. Polish had more speakers than Welsh, but Urdu was the leading one numerically in Manchester. I predict that in the next census in Manchester, Arabic will overtake Urdu, but let's wait and see. So we now move to a group of related languages, part of the same language family, which we call in linguistics the Indo-Aryan languages. So languages that are spoken in South Asia, and they're related, sometimes very closely related to one another. And the largest of those spoken in Manchester are Urdu and Bengali. And speakers of those two languages are almost all Muslims. There are very few, if any, non-Muslims who speak those languages as their family languages. Closely followed by Punjabi. Now, Punjabi is spoken not just by Muslims, but also by Sikhs. And interestingly, Sikhs also write Punjabi. They use Punjabi as their liturgical and written languages. Muslims usually, in my experience, who speak Punjabi don't write it. They usually use Urdu as a written language, but not Punjabi. Punjabi also has its own scripts, which most Muslim speakers of Punjabi that I've met are not actually familiar with that script. There are other Indo-Aryan languages that are spoken in Manchester, and they include Potwari and Mirpuri, that are very closely related, as well as Kashmiri, mainly kind of in Oldham and Rochdale and other areas, and Gujarati. Those languages are spoken almost exclusively by Muslims as well. Now, interestingly, I'll come back to bilingualism in a moment, but Potwari and Mirpuri are usually spoken in households where Urdu is also spoken, and the languages are very similar, and many people will often move back and forth in the sentence between those languages, and Punjabi as well. They're all from broadly the same region, also in Pakistan and northern India. Speakers of Gujarati, of course, originate from India or from East Africa. And Gujarati has its own script, and I'll come back to scripts and writing systems in a moment. Then we move to another language family, which is related to Indo-Aryan, but is a distinct family of languages, and those are the Iranian languages. And the most noticeable of those is Persian. There's also another variety of Persian that is spoken in Afghanistan. You may have heard about it recently in the news. It's called Dari. And Dari and Persian are basically the same language. It's basically Manchester and Liverpool English. in that way. But speakers very much like to distinguish them. And people from Iran will say that they speak Persian, and those from Afghanistan will say that they speak Dari. Kurdish is another Iranian language, and there are two main varieties of Kurdish. The first is called Sorani, and is spoken in Iraq and Iran. And the second is called Kurmanji, and is spoken in northern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. These varieties they're often mutually intelligible with some difficulty. It depends really on people's experience. There are quite a few differences between them. And I know many young people who prefer to speak English with one another rather than tackle the dialect differences. And then there's Pashto, which is another Iranian language, also spoken in Afghanistan. We then have a number of African languages that are spoken by Muslims in Manchester. And unlike the previous ones like Indo-Aryan and Iranian, which are language families, African languages are not a language family. They're not related languages. I'm simply referring to them as a category because of their geographical origin. And the languages that are spoken by Manchester Muslims that are African languages are Somali, of course. Manchester is one of the two main Somali communities in the country after London. And you find it mainly in Rusholme and Moss Side, some in Bolton as well. And Swahili, but the Swahili that is spoken in Manchester is mainly spoken by people from Somalia, and they speak a particular dialect of Swahili called Brava or Bravanese. And many people don't know because you go through the Somali kind of areas of Manchester and there's a high density and you think everybody speaks Somali, but many of them speak Swahili actually at home. The two are not related. Then there is Hausa, which is spoken in northern Nigeria. And many Nigerians in Manchester, but also people from other neighboring countries speak Hausa, sometimes as their second or third language. And then there's a language called Tamazight or Tamazight, which is the language also known as Berber. It's a minority language in North Africa, unrelated to Arabic, at least not directly related. And the speakers of Tamazight in Manchester are mainly from Libya. There's a sizable community. And then we go to just two more language groups. There's South Asian languages, but probably not really worthy of giving a long list apart from Malay and Indonesian. Malay and Indonesian are pretty much the same language. And there's a sizable population, many of them students. So they kind of come and go, but there's a steady presence of Malay, Indonesian speaking students in Manchester. And finally, Turkic languages. Turkic languages are spoken across a vast area from the Balkans, in fact, from Macedonia and all the way to China. And we have almost that entire presence here in Manchester. So obviously Turkish is a Turkic language. Kazakh is also a Turkic language. And there are many students, again, they come and go, but students from Kazakhstan who speak Kazakh in Manchester. And then there's a small but very present Uyghur community. And maybe you heard just yesterday, there was an event in solidarity with the peril of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province or East Turkestan in China. They have been subjected in recent years to horrible oppression, cultural oppression, which is also a linguistic oppression. And their language is a Turkic language, quite closely related to Kazakh and other Turkic languages of Central Asia. So that's kind of the overview. And I'd like to touch on just a couple of points before I conclude. So the first is, as I promised, bilingualism. When I say, there are communities that speak languages, they speak more than one languages quite often at home, more than one community language. So people are bilingual in Yiddish and Hebrew, either liturgical Hebrew or those who are from the Orthodox community speak Hebrew usually also speak Yiddish. I've already mentioned the Urdu, Punjabi, Potwari, Mirpuri, multilingualism in the household. Kurdish speakers are almost always bilingual because they speak a regional minority language from their countries of origin. So those who are from Syria and Iraq also speak Arabic. Those who are from Iran also speak Persian. And those who are from Turkey also speak Turkish. And you often see signs in Kurdish and Sorani Kurdish that are almost always bilingual in Kurdish and Arabic as well. Speakers of Dari and Pashto tend to be bilingual, the two languages of Afghanistan. There are speakers of Arabic from Khuzestan in Iran, Khuzestan province, and they also know Persian. I already mentioned the Bravanese, Swahili, and Somali bilingualism, and many Somali people in Manchester also speak Sudanese Arabic. The Tamazight, the Berbers from North Africa also know Arabic. The Uyghurs from China also know Chinese, and the Kazakhs usually also know Russian. So when we talk about community language, native language, mother tongue, all those concepts, we have to kind of be a bit careful because they're never absolute. People have repertoires of languages that they use for different purposes and different times, and quite often mix them together. So finally, I just want to touch on written languages and scripts. So basically, we'll take that tour again, just very briefly from the other perspective, from the perspective of the script. The difference between script and alphabet is the way you use a script for a particular language. Okay, so there's the English alphabet and the French alphabet. They're different, but they use the same script. Okay, so the Hebrew script is used for Hebrew and for Yiddish. The Arabic script is used for a whole range of languages: Arabic, Urdu, Persian, Pashto, Sorani Kurdish, Uyghur also uses the Arabic script. Bengali and Gujarati each have their own scripts, and they are related to the Sanskrit and Hindi script. Punjabi also has its own script, which is related to those, but as I pointed out before, Punjabi is usually not written by Muslims. Muslims speak Punjabi, but they usually don't write it. The Roman script, which we use for English, is the one that's used for Somali, for Malay, for Turkish, for Kurmanji Kurdish, and for Hausa when it's written. Not many people write Hausa. The Cyrillic script, which is the one that's used for Russian, is also used for Kazakh. And Tamazight has its own script, and that's very interesting. If you have a chance, have a look. It's a very, very ancient script, at least 2,000 years old, but it is very rarely used. And people that I know who speak Tamazight in Manchester, when they text to each other, they use Arabic script to write Tamazight, but they improvise. And when you walk the streets of Manchester, you'll see signs in, as I said, in around 50 languages. And the languages of Jews and Muslims in which you find signs, public signs in Manchester are, as I said, Hebrew, Yiddish, like I said, only indoors primarily. Arabic, and Arabic has taken over in recent years the Curry Mile, and most of the signage that is not English in the Curry Mile nowadays is in Arabic. And otherwise there are dense areas, Cheetham Hill Road, for example, but you see Arabic all over the city, really. Urdu used to be the most prominent, but is gradually receding and giving way to Arabic in many areas. Bengali, there is still a cluster of retail outlets around Longsight that have signs in Bengali. Sorani Kurdish can be found in Russian on many signs. Persian signs you find occasionally Somali in Russian and Moss Side, and occasionally Turkish. And what is quite interesting is that there are, I found many signs around Manchester that combine Somali, Urdu, and Arabic, for example, butcher shops in particular. And they seem to be placed in areas where not necessarily all those three languages are spoken. So people have become very much aware that there are populations that have similar needs in terms of shopping. I mean, butcher shops are clearly one where people looking for halal meat. And so the clientele is addressed in the different languages around the city, regardless of whether or not there is an immediately local population that speaks those languages. And finally, just to note that, as I mentioned before, supplementary schools play a very important role, the most important role in maintaining the linguistic heritage of communities in Manchester. In the Jewish Orthodox community, Hebrew and Yiddish are taught. Hebrew is taught as a subject. Yiddish is more the means of instruction, but they do read sometimes texts in Yiddish as well. There are perhaps a couple dozen supplementary schools that teach Arabic, at least one Persian school and one Kurdish school, 2 or 3 schools that teach Bengali. Urdu fluctuates quite considerably, and that is partly because Urdu is a language that is taught in a number of state schools in Manchester. I can think right now of at least 3, so Burnage Academy for boys and Wally Range and Levenshulme High School for girls have had GCSE and A-level in Urdu for many, many years now, and sometimes other schools offer that as well. Whereas the other community languages, save Arabic, and are not usually taught. Hebrew is taught in the private religious schools. And I'll conclude with that, and with this to saying how important, once again, the contribution of supplementary schools is. This is something that I've been highlighting for many years, and in conversation with leaders in the city, in cultural institutions and the city council. And I'd like to close once again. I mean, some are among us today with reach out to you and say, you know, we really need to do more to support the fabulous and important work that supplementary schools are doing in the city. Thank you very much.